The night of October 24, 1944 fell thick over the Philippine Islands. The Sea of Mindanao breathed slow under a lid of cloud. A dark river of current slipped through Surigao Strait and drew foam into long white threads that could not be seen unless a man leaned close to the rail and let his eyes adjust. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had already begun to spread across the map like a fire finding dry grass. In the east, the fast carriers of the Third Fleet hunted the enemy mobile fleet. In the central waters, a decoy force tugged at American attention. In the south, an old and deadly blade edged forward. The southern force of Admiral Shoji Nishimura drove for Surigao Strait with the battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, the heavy cruiser Mogami, and destroyers that carried names like ghosts: Shigure, Asagumo, Michishio, Yamagumo. Steel and steam and trained men moved in darkness toward a narrow gate. The Seventh Fleet waited for them inside that gate. On the chart table aboard a plywood hull painted green, a young skipper traced the narrows with a blunt pencil. He spoke softly to his exec so the men on deck could not hear the worry in his voice. His boat was fast and light, an 80-foot Elco with 3 Packard engines in the stern. The fuel pumps had a smell like hot varnish. The exhaust coughed clean in the cool air. The men called it a PT boat because motor torpedo boat was too long to say when wind and spray were trying to take a voice. The skipper had taken PT boats through reef passes in the Solomons. He had run black nights off New Guinea with rain so hard it felt like needles. He had watched the bow spit white water at 40 knots and had felt the boat leap across a chop like a thing alive. He had never felt a night quite like this. The strait was narrow. The enemy plan was ruthless. The Seventh Fleet had a trap inside Surigao Strait, and the first trigger on that trap was these small boats hiding along the coasts like cats waiting by a mouse hole. On shore, the jungle of Leyte was a heavy wall at the edge of the water. The palms leaned inland under a wind that came from the south. Far down the strait, watch fires on small islands burned low and steady. In the black space between those points, the PT boat sections waited at assigned ambush stations. Each section leader watched and so radar set sweep its thin green arm across a round screen. The voice circuits were quiet. The squadron commanders kept the net clear. The orders for the night were simple and hard. Detect the enemy. Report bearings and ranges. Strike with torpedoes. Force the Japanese to comb wakes and turn out of column. Pass contact to the destroyer pickets. Bleed their speed. Break their alignment. Pull them into the jaws of the Seventh Fleet battle line that waited across the top of Surigao Strait. See first. Hit. Live to report. That was the doctrine. The PT boats lay on water that smelled of mangrove and silt and salt. A light chop knocked against their chins and made a sound like someone tapping a barrel with the back of a spoon. The men smoked quietly under cupped hands and kept their cigarettes low. The gunners cantered their twin 50 mounts to low ready and felt the smooth cold of the butterfly triggers. Aft, the 20mm sat with its magazine locked and its sights at 0. Depth charges crouched on their racks and waited like squat iron guards. The torpedoes lay in roll-off racks on the deck amidships. A man could reach out and touch their round steel sides and feel a little warmth left from the day. The Packard engines dozed. When they woke, they would wake all at once. Across the Gulf, the enemy cutters felt the same night as a friend. On Yamashiro, a petty officer paused beside a hatch and looked up. He saw no stars. He felt the ship move under his feet with a long and patient stride. The battleship smelled of hot paint and boiler feedwater and the spice of cooked rice from a galley he could not see. A division officer passed by and told him to mind the bridge lights and the telephone circuits. The officer's voice was even. There was honor in this run. There was duty at stake for the Empire. He believed it. He did not know that the strait ahead had a chain of small American boats that would bite first and give warning to the larger American teeth waiting behind them. The skipper on the PT boat listened to the radar man call the slow chant of bearing and faint return. The long line of the coast made a kind of echo that fooled the set. The SO antenna lifted and dipped as the boat turned into small swells. The radar man kept his thumb and forefinger tight on the gain control and whispered that he had a ghost at 16,000 yards. Then it was gone. Then it came back stronger, and behind it a second ghost and a third. The skipper leaned in and watched the sweep pass. He knew that fear can make a false picture on a scope. He also knew that sometimes the first fuzzy hint is the only warning a man gets before the sea ahead becomes a hard and bright place. He breathed through his nose and counted. He told the exec to call the section and the next section up the strait. He picked up the handset and spoke to the 7th Fleet Fighter Direction Center ashore with a voice that held steady. Contact south-southwest. Multiple returns in line. Estimated speed 20 knots. Range now 15,000. Bearing steady. This is Surigao Strait. This is the southern gate to the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The message moved down wires to a bunker where men in shirtsleeves plotted the marks on a board. In that room, the picture grew from rumor to track. The 7th Fleet battle plan woke up one piece at a time. The skipper ordered engines to half. The boat slid forward on black water and came alive underfoot. The bow wave rose, a thin white whisper. The wake lengthened and smoothed. The crew moved to their torpedo stations. The exec checked the stop bolts and pins at the racks and put a hand on each fish as if to bless it. The engine man in the stern tweaked the mixture and watched the tatch needles hover at an even beat. The quartermaster bent over the compass. The radar man counted down range. 12,000. 11. The skipper did not want the first torpedoes to run long. He wanted to fire and peel away and keep the enemy turning their bows to chase empty wakes. A PT boat could not stand and trade gunfire with a battleship. PT boat killed by surprise. That is what it was built to do. The Japanese column pushed into the narrow part of Surigao Strait. The current drew at the bows and the helmsman compensated with small helm. The destroyers screened ahead and to the flanks, wary of submarines and ambush boats. The battleships held the center. The cruiser Mogami followed. The plan was to push past the mouth of the strait and into the bay beyond where American transports crowded the beaches and the sea room was wide. The enemy assumed that speed and night would help them. They did not account for the ring of small American craft with radar and radios and eyes that had learned to see in the dark. The first torpedo run began when the skipper saw the blacker black of a ship's bow beyond the white bite of its wave. He did not need the radar to tell him anymore. He could feel it now in the way the engine note bounced off something solid ahead. He signaled with his hand. The exec yanked the latch on the first rack. The torpedo rolled and splashed. The nose dipped and then the engine bit and the track turned into a quick line of bubbles that lay low on the surface. The second fish went. Then the third. The skipper eased the boat into a turn that would carry them north in the shelter of a headland. He told the gunner to stay low and hold fire unless someone on the enemy side lit them up. The boat leapt forward and spray broke hard on the bow and found faces and tasted of salt and fuel. Out in the strait, men on a Japanese destroyer saw white lines crossing their path at an angle. They knew in an instant what it meant. The officer of the deck shouted orders to comb the wakes. The helmsman spun the wheel. The destroyer heeled hard to port and the bow chewed through one line of bubbles. A torpedo flashed white aft on the starboard quarter and vanished. It did not hit. Another track passed ahead of the stem and died in dark water. The men breathed again, and then a second PT section further up the strait dropped 4 more fish. The destroyer had no time to find a groove. The column began to ripple. The tight line loosened. The speed wavered. Radios crackled on Japanese decks with curt orders. Maintain course. Clear torpedoes. Keep alignment. It is easy to write those words. It is hard to keep them when white scars are crossing your bow again and again. The PT boats did not stop. One boat cut across the track of the Japanese column at 900 yards and let fly. Another pulled in under the lee of an island and threw fish at a steep angle that would force the second battleship to turn. The boats called bearings and ranges into the 7th Fleet net. Surigao Strait repeated itself in their mouths and in the ears that listened ashore. The small boats made the night longer. They added time to the fight. Time is a weapon when a larger plan is closing its hand. Gunfire came back over the black water. Orange tongues licked from the bows of Japanese destroyers. Tracers dug lines along the wave tops. Shells tore into jungle and threw leaves and sprays that looked like sparks. A searchlight speared out and found a slick, pale piece of wake. A Japanese gun crew chased it with fire. their tracers stitched and vanished in a hiss. The PT boat that had laid that wake was already gone around a point of land and now lay silent with engines at idle. The crew could hear their own breath and the click of hot metal cooling. They watched the light swing to the left and right and then die. The skipper moved his hand in a small circle. The engineman brought power up in a smooth, near-silent swell until all 3 packets were singing again and the boat leapt forward for a second attack. The Japanese force pushed on, but not at the clean speed they had hoped for. The battleship Yamashiro held her course and wore a cloak of discipline. The battleship Fuso tried to keep station in rough current. The cruiser Mogami followed orders, but her helmsman had the problem of wake and swirl that builds along high banks. The destroyers took more of the fire than their brothers in the center because they had to head toward the white streaks and dare them. One destroyer never saw the 4th fish from a boat tucked inside a bend. The torpedo ran under her stern and failed to detonate. The relief that swept the deck lasted only a heartbeat. Another spread crossed ahead. The destroyer turned hard. The column behind opened gaps that were not in the plan. The southern force bled speed and bled order. The skipper of one PT boat felt in his bones that the night was starting to lean his way. The 7th Fleet destroyer pickets listened to the PT reports and cut their own angles to meet the column. On the eastern shore of Surigao Strait, a line of American destroyers prepared to launch torpedoes into that loosened Japanese formation. On the western shore, another line made ready to do the same. In the northern throat of the strait, the battle line waited across like a door bolted shut. USS West Virginia BB-48, USS Tennessee BB-43, USS California BB-44, USS Maryland BB-46, USS Mississippi BB-41, USS Pennsylvania BB-38. Their fire control radars slept with eyes open in the night. The cruisers Louisville and Portland and Denver and Columbia and Boise and Phoenix sat with their own guns trained out and ready. The 7th Fleet had built a corridor of flame and iron across Surigao Strait. To spring it, they needed the enemy to enter it. The PT boats were the hands pulling the enemy feet onto those floorboards. A small boat like a PT had its own ways of fear. The skipper felt them gather in places he could not see. He could not tell his men that it would be all right, because he did not know what the next 5 minutes would bring. He could only keep his voice flat and his orders clear. Come right 5. Open up to 25 knots. Reduce to low idle. Wait. The radar man breathed into his microphone in little puffs that he could not hear but the skipper could. The exec tapped the pin latch on the last torpedo with the nail of his thumb and then left it alone. The gunner tightened and loosened the pitch of his windmills and checked his ammo box again as if bullets could evaporate. The quartermaster watched the black shape of a headland draw down the starboard bow, then watched it slide aft, then turn into a dark wall off the quarter. The sound of the engines changed when that wall reflected it back. The skipper felt that change in the soles of his feet. He knew he was exactly where he meant to be. Spray came over the bow and broke across shoulders and helmets. The wind put a taste of salt on tongues and left grit along teeth. The men did not bother to wipe it away. The next Japanese salvo came and fell 20 yards to port. The white shapes of splashes lifted like ghosts. A projectile from a cruiser went long and fell in the jungle with a rolling cough. Firefly sparks danced over the treetops and there was a smell of burned leaf. The PT boat held its course and the skipper for the first time that night felt the odd calm of a good plan becoming a real thing around him. He had one torpedo left. He meant to put it where a battleship would have to choose which god to trust. He eased the throttles up and the packets answered with a smooth roar that rolled in his chest. The boat stepped forward and the bow wave spread to either side and made a thin white mustache on the dark water. The radar man sang his numbers. The exec called angle on the bow. The skipper slid beyond the headland and saw the dark mountain of a ship 2 points off the port bow. He felt the weight of it. He had never seen a battleship so close at night. He threw the wheel. The boat canted and the men leaned without thinking. The exec pulled the final pin. The last torpedo rolled and bit. The skipper held course long enough to see the line of bubbles lay itself across the enemy's path. Then he hauled the boat around and ran for the shadows of the western shore like a man who had thrown a spear at a charging boar. On Yamashiro, a watch officer felt the hair rise along his arms. He shouted helm to starboard. The helmsman spun the wheel. The bow turned. The white track crossed astern and went away. The officer bit down on anger and pride. He called the signal to maintain formation. He told himself that the PT boats were an annoyance and not a threat. Then another spread crossed ahead. Then another. One destroyer to port radioed that she had been hit. Another cried that she had lost steering. The line sagged. The battleships pushed on. But the path was now a crooked lane, not a straight road. The watch officer felt respect harden in his chest for the men who had put those small boats so deep into the throat of Surigao Strait. Hours moved slowly at sea at night and also fast the way a fuse burns. The PT boats kept biting and calling. Surigao Strait appeared again and again in the plots at command. The words Battle of Leyte Gulf gathered weight beside those plots. The 7th Fleet picket destroyers felt the enemy presence like a cold wind coming around a corner. The order went by voice and by blinker. Prepare to launch torpedoes. The destroyer squadron leaders had drilled the combinations so often that they could do them in their sleep. It still took courage to turn into danger and show a broadside to a battleship's guns. On the eastern shore, an American destroyer laid a full spread. The wakes reached like fingers and found a Japanese destroyer that had drifted out of position and was trying to find her place again. A hit brought a sheet of flame and a broken back. On the western shore, another American destroyer dashed in, launched, and leapt back under a bank of smoke that hung over the water like a low roof. The PT boats heard the hits and cheered without noise, because there was no time to make sound. They had more reports to send and more tracks to lay. The Japanese southern force had lost its rhythm. The hard part of night fighting is not just seeing. It is deciding. Every minute the enemy spent deciding was a minute the 7th Fleet needed. The skipper of the PT boat knew this without saying it. He had seen the same thing in the Solomons. Speed is a weapon, but so is confusion. He kept pressure on. He put the boat where he would put a thumb on a bruise. He did not let the enemy rest. The battle line in the north set stations across the top of Surigao Strait. The old battleships that had been raised and rebuilt after Pearl Harbor took their places like men who had been cut down and learned to stand again. West Virginia's radar locked targets in the dark with a certainty that men still found hard to believe. The fire control officers on Tennessee and California leaned over repeaters and watched the numbers come together. Mississippi and Maryland held in reserve. Pennsylvania struggled with radar interference and watched with teeth clenched, wishing to fire, waiting until it could do so with a clean mind. The cruisers made ready to add their weight. The destroyers formed a screen that could shift and bite as the battle demanded. The 7th Fleet had built the kind of fight that naval war books used to explain principles, only this was no book. The PT boats made their last calls and slid off the main axis of the battle. They had to. Their fuel was low. Their torpedo racks were empty or nearly so. Their crews were wet and spent. Their gunners kept scanning for planes or for enemy boats trying to do to them what they had done to the enemy. They did not leave the field completely. They took stations that would let them rescue men who went into the water and that would let them finish a cripple if one drifted down on the tide. They watched the mouth of the strait grow bright with lightning that had no thunder. They heard through their radios the flat reports of battleship guns fired by radar solution at ranges that would have been impossible a few years before. They smelled the odd sweetness that comes when flashless powder burns in heavy amounts. They saw the northern sky flicker. When the first full salvo from the American battle line went out, the night above Surigao Strait turned into a moving geometry of fire. West Virginia set the tone with a ladder of shells that reached out and found Yamashiro. Tennessee and California added their patterns. Maryland joined. Cruisers threw in secondary batteries and the air was layered with arcs and streaks. The tracers from destroyer mounts close to shore looked like hot bees swarming. The flat white flashes from the big rifles rolled in sequence, and the sound came off the water like a train that never slowed. Men on the PT boats felt it through their ribs. Men on Japanese decks felt it in their teeth. Yamashiro took steel with the dumb courage of a made thing. Plates buckled. Fires started and were beaten and started again. Turrets swung and spoke. The battleship held course as long as there was a course to hold. Fuso had already fallen behind and would not come out of that tangle hole. Mogami tried to help and found only more concentrated fury. The destroyers that had survived the passage south were now cut and bleeding and could not spare much more blood. The 7th Fleet had closed the top of Surigao Strait with a row of guns that reached into the dark and pulled ships apart. The skipper on the PT boat watched and felt a kind of awe that had nothing to do with romance. It was the awe a craftsman feels when a shop full of tools works as designed. The PT boats had done their part. They had reported. They had laid fish and forced turns. They had run under the noses of ships that could have crushed them without noticing. Now the line pieces finished the plan. He would later remember little snatches. The taste of salt in the corner of his mouth. The way the radar glow made men's faces look pale and unreal. The way the boat felt as if it were holding its breath while the big ships in the north took theirs and exhaled flame. By the time dawn touched the far edge of the sky with a smear of gray, the southern force was broken. Wreckage moved with the current. Flames flickered on the surface like coals under wet ash. A battered destroyer drifted south, engines dead. A line of men along her rail. The PT boats came out again with jerry cans and cutters and wash lines and hauled men from water that smelled of oil and fear. Some of the men wore khaki. Some wore blue. Some wore white. War puts a man in water the same way no matter the flag he follows. The PT crews obeyed their orders. Rescue when able. Finish a threat if it still breathes. Take prisoners if they can be taken alive. Pass the wounded to the larger ships. The 7th Fleet would see to the rest. The skipper brought his boat alongside a raft and leaned down with a gaff to snag a loop of rope. The raft carried 3 men and a heap of burned planks. One of the men looked up at him and tried to speak in Japanese. The skipper shook his head and put a canteen to the man's lips and said easy. The man drank. He coughed thick and wet. The skipper felt the raft bump the hull and then slide along the chine and then sit still under his hand. He had the queer sense that he had seen the man before with a telescope from a low ridge in New Georgia, only that was impossible. War makes strangers look like people you already know, because they hold their bodies the same way when they are tired and afraid. Ashore, the fighter direction officer at the 7th Fleet plot wrote a neat line under the night's work. Surigao Strait. Southern force engaged and defeated. Destroyers and battleships engaged as planned. PT boats made first contact and delivered multiple attacks. Doctrine validated. He did not write the smell of hot packets or the feel of salt in eyes. He did not need to. His job was to keep the map true. In the wardroom of a cruiser later that day, an officer of the battle line spoke with respect about the small boats that had been the eyes and first teeth of the night. He did not speak in grand terms. He named the strait. He named the PT squadrons. He named the sections. He honored facts because facts are heavy and do not blow away. He said that the PT boats along Surigao Strait had made the enemy break stride. He said that the Battle of Leyte Gulf would carry many names by the time the war was done, but the first words spoken in that southern channel had belonged to men in plywood boats with the engines of racing cars and the courage of old sailors. He was not wrong. In Japan, a surviving officer who had stood on the bridge of Yamashiro wrote later in a small book. He wrote of the shock of seeing white wakes cross ahead and the shame of being turned by small boats. He wrote of the hard pride in the men who kept their stations anyway. He wrote of the thunder in the north that never seemed to stop. He wrote the name Surigao Strait with a hand that paused and then moved on. He did not need to add that he had been stunned by the speed of the American gnats or by the way the American battle line had closed the gate. The words were already warm on the page. The skipper took his PT boat back up the strait that afternoon in daylight. The water looked like a different sea. The jungle was green and loud with birds. The shoreline was close and honest. The narrow channel that had felt like a throat at night felt like a river now. He could point to bends and say we were there when the searchlight swung. He could point to a shoal and say the track ran across there and we held back and let the destroyers take the next bite. He could point north and say that is where West Virginia and Tennessee and California stood and fired by radar. He could point south and say the enemy came up that way and they were not the same after the first turn. He did not speak like a hero. He spoke like a man who had done a hard job. In the weeks that followed, the name Surigao Strait took its place in the talk of mess decks and ready rooms. The PT boat crews told the story with hands, showing the angle of wakes, the swing of a rudder, the way a small hull leans when it jumps to 40 knots. The destroyer men told it with timings, with launch sequences, with ranges and ladder spreads. The battleship men told it with the deep satisfaction of a firing solution that could be trusted and a sky that answered to numbers. The 7th Fleet staff used it as a lesson in doctrine. Step 1. Patrol line of PT boats. Step 2. Destroyer torpedo attacks. Step 3. Battle line across the top of the strait. Finish. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had many parts. Surigao Strait was the part where the old ideas about crossing a met the new eyes of radar and the new legs of small boats with radios that worked. The skipper wrote a letter home on a quiet Sunday. He did not say much. He said he had been busy. He said the boat had done her work. He said the men were good and they had been lucky. He said the name of the strait. He said the date. He tucked the letter into a pouch that would not reach America for weeks. He went up on deck and looked toward the south where the dark line of the Dinagat Islands lay like a low wall. He could still smell burned oil from places where the current had pushed it into pockets near the shore. He watched a flock of terns wheel and settle. He thought about sleep and did not go below. He stayed on deck and listened to the water slap the hull. At night, when noise on the anchorage quieted, he would sometimes wake and think for a second that he heard the thin scream of a shell passing overhead. Then he would remember where he was and the feeling would go away. The boat was a living thing, creaked and complained and then went still. The men slept in turns with life jackets for pillows and dreams that did not last long enough to have plots. They ate coffee and canned hash and thick bread that tasted like the bakery had added motor oil. They laughed at the same old jokes and made new ones that would not live beyond the next port. He knew that another night would come, somewhere north along the coast of Luzon or in the narrow channels of Ormoc Bay. He knew that PT boats would again hide in black water and count seconds while the radar swept. He knew that the Japanese Navy would not forget Surigao Strait, and that they would come harder and with more caution. He knew that the Battle of Leyte Gulf had bent the arc of the war in the Philippines. He knew that a man cannot see the arc when he is standing under it. He only sees the work that is right in front of him. On a hill above the 7th Fleet harbor, a small group of Filipino fishermen watched the American ships and spoke quietly of nights on the strait that had been theirs long before war came. They knew currents and eddies that no chart marked. They knew spots where the water went slick as oil when the tide turned. They had watched the small boats of the Americans race by in darkness on that night and had felt a private pride that the sea they knew had given those boats a path. Later the skipper would take a handful of cigarettes ashore and give them to a man who had pointed to a notch in a headland and said that is where the water runs like a mill race. The skipper would use that notch on another night. He would not forget to say thank you when he returned. In the years that followed, a line on a wall map in a schoolroom would carry the name Surigao Strait. A teacher would point with a stick and say the southern approach to the Battle of Leyte Gulf was here. A boy would look at the map and see only blue and green. He would not smell burned cordite or diesel. He would not taste salt in the back of his throat. He would not know what a Packard engine sounds like when it wakes from idle to full and drags a boat forward as if the sea were soft cloth. The boy would learn names: West Virginia, Tennessee, California, Maryland, Mississippi, Pennsylvania, Louisville, Portland, Denver, Columbia, Boise, Phoenix. He would hear the word radar and think of a green screen and a steady sweep. He would not know that a man's breath can fog that screen if he leans too close, and that if he is scared he will lean even closer until someone taps him on the shoulder and tells him to breathe. The skipper would know. He would not be in that room to tell it. The sea forgets nothing, but it does not leave marks where the eye can see them. Surigao Strait looks today as it looked the day before the fight and the day after. The tide runs north and the tide runs south and the water takes back what men throw at it. A chart can tell you where the bottom rises and where it falls. It cannot tell you that a man can hide behind a headland with engines at idle and feel the enemy move by him like a train in the night. It cannot tell you that a small boat can deliver an idea into the heart of a large one, and that the idea is simple. You are not alone in the dark. The skipper stands on the deck of his boat and looks along the length of Surigao Strait. He can name the waypoints without looking at the paper. He can draw them in his head. He can feel the exact moment the rudder needs just a touch of starboard to keep the bow from swinging too close to a shoal. He can say with calm pride that the PT boats of the 7th Fleet did their part. He can say quietly that Japanese sailors who came up the channel that night were stunned by how quickly the small boats found them and by how many times the white tracks of torpedoes cut their path. He can say that those men kept to their duty as best they could, and that respect does not cancel victory. He can say that Surigao Strait belongs to everyone who went there and lived. He can also say that for one long night it belonged to America. The Battle of Leyte Gulf will always be told with many chapters. There is the story of carriers and sea room to the north. There is the story of a small task unit that fought like a cornered wolf off Samar. There is the story of ships that were sunk and ships that were saved by seamanship and luck. There is the story of deception and bait and radio silence. Inside that large book is a lean, hard chapter with plain words. Surigao Strait, 7th Fleet, Battle boats, destroyers, battle line, crossing the T. Old battleships with modern eyes. Enemy battleships that walked into the gate and never walked out. The chapter is simple because it was built on a plan carried out by men who had practiced and believed in it. The chapter is powerful because small boats bit first and made the rest of the plan possible. The skipper writes the names on the inside cover of a small notebook. He writes Surigao Strait. He writes Battle of Leyte Gulf. He writes 7th Fleet. He writes PT boats. He writes the names of the big ships he could see when the sky to the north turned white and orange. West Virginia, Tennessee, California, Maryland, Mississippi, Pennsylvania. He writes them because names are anchors in the mind. He writes them because when he is old he will want to make sure he says them right when a young person asks him what it was like. He writes them because he knows that the sea forgets nothing, but men are busy and forget easily if no one helps them remember. He thinks about the men in the other boats. He thinks about the radar scope glow on their faces and the quiet in their voices when contact became track and track became target. He thinks about the sound of a torpedo rolling and the splash and the briefly silent moment after, when the boat seems to listen with the men to the sea and to fate. He thinks about the first time he tasted the gritty film that gunfire leaves on the tongue, and how now he almost looks forward to that proof that he is still alive and doing his job. He thinks about how a PT boat is just wood and engines and weapons until you put men on it who know one another and then it becomes more than parts. He thinks these things and then he lets them go. There will be more nights. There will be more work. At sunset the sky goes blood orange and then purple behind the low hills. The water takes that color and turns it into a long burnished path. The skipper feels the day tilt into night again and he feels that small pull inside his chest that always comes with it. Night is when his boat is most itself. Night is when the PT boats of the 7th Fleet earn their keep. Night is when Surigao Strait is more narrow and more dangerous and more honest. He watches the color drain out of the sky and the sea, and he breathes in and out and tastes salt and oil and a hint of jungle on the wind. He looks at his men and he sees in their faces the steady calm that comes when a crew has done something hard together and knows it. The radio man steps out with a slip in his hand and says there is a message. It is short. Patrol at dusk tomorrow. Same sector. Maintain contact with pickets. The skipper nods and says copy. He tells the men to secure from battle stations and set the watch. He tells the engine man to baby the center packard because it ran hot during the last run. He tells the gunner to clean the twin 50s like a chapel bell, which makes the gunner laugh. He tells the exec to take the first watch and wake him if the radar finds anything that does not belong. The boat slides in its moorings and the tide turns and the jungle makes night sounds and the men sleep again on their jackets with helmets tilted down over their eyes. Somewhere out beyond the southern horizon, men in another fleet talk about Leyte and about a duty that still burns in them. They will try again. War does not stop because one gate was closed and one column cut down. The skipper knows this. He knows that his boat matters because it is small and quick and brave. He knows that the name Surigao Strait will be said with pride by men in his navy. He knows that the men in the other navy will say the same name softly and the word stunned will sit beside it in their mouths whether they speak it aloud or not. The sea keeps rolling. The tide keeps pushing north and south. The birds lift off the water and land again. The sun comes and goes. The engines start and stop. The radar sweeps and rests. The men wake and sleep. The work is never done until the day the war ends. On that day, the skipper will take his boat out one last time and run it fast across a patch of open water for the joy of it. He will throttle back and listen to the engines tick and cool. He will look at the line of hills and the wide mouth of Surigao Strait, and he will say to himself that he was there on the night when small boats were first and large guns were last, and when plan and courage and craft made the enemy turn and stumble. He will not say more. He will not need to.